Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look and installing the Roadmaster Rear Sway Bar on a 2018 Thor Windsport. Here we have our sway bar installed, and you can actually see we have this new sway bar, but we also have our existing one because this doesn't replace the rear sway bar. It's in addition to. So really it's going to just kind of beef up what this one can't handle, and that's really going to smooth a lot of things out. Whether it be a quick turn, you're going to notice the difference, wind gusts while you're driving on the highway, being on uneven road, and just overall you're not going to have to white knuckle as much. Sway bars really keep the vehicle balanced by using the weight of the vehicle and the offset of the suspension on the other side to counteract it, and that way your vehicle is not tipping, because as it tips it actually pushes that pressure back on the other one, and that's going to keep you stable. Now, if you've driven in windy conditions on the highway or just kind of rough roads, you really are having to fight the wheel quite often, and that makes for an exhausting time while driving. So that way when you get to the campsite, you're probably wiped out from driving and not being able to just relax. And this is going to be a great addition, because since it's installed on the vehicle, you're going to see results every time you drive it. The first turn you make, you're going to notice it's going to be a little more agile and also a little more confidence inspiring. As you hit bumps or just track on the highway, it's going to be more stable, and it's going to have a better poised suspension feeling, giving you confidence while you drive. So we've taken this out on our test course, and we'll show you the before and after, how it actually performs. So as we take this out, a lot of times in a large vehicle like this, it does feel like it's swaying. It's rather top heavy, and so every bump and every uneven surface really does translate more because of that top heaviness. It does tend to sway. And these sway bars, when installed, generally give it a lot better feel. So hopefully once we get it installed, we're going to notice a big difference. Now that we have it installed, let's take it back out on the test course and see the difference. Instantly, I noticed that it is quite a bit more agile, and just one turn and you notice that it's more planted. It feels like it has a quicker response, and the steering actually kind of gets a little sharper, as well as just the ride in general, just a little tighter in a good way. You don't lose any comfort in the way that the sway bar works. It's just when you start to lean one way or the other, you can kind of feel it just playing itself, and overall it's just way more confidence inspiring while driving. So now that we've talked about what the actual sway bar does, we're going to take a look at the installation. Now this is definitely a job that it just seems pretty simple as far as a few bolts mounting in, but you are dealing with some heavy duty bolts, and so you're really going to want to make sure that you have some heavy duty impacts, a breaker bar, and maybe some leverage, as well as a torque wrench that reaches a pretty high torque rating. But if you have all of those, this can absolutely be done at home, and I'm going to walk you through all those steps. To begin our install, we're actually going to have our vehicle on the ground, and you're going to want to raise your jacks up. And what that's going to do is it's going to raise the RV up and allow those leaf springs to kind of droop, and that's where we're going to get our bolts that are in the frame rail. Now they are kind of tricky to see unless you put your jacks up, and then you should be able to see it from the tire side on the driver over. And we're going to be taking a 21 millimeter. I'm going to knock them loose with this, and that way I have lots of leverage. And then once I actually get those rotating just a little bit, I'm actually going to use a rotating wrench or a ratcheting wrench, because it's going to be a little bit easier between the space between the frame rail and the leaf spring. So grab a 21 millimeter socket and a nice breaker bar, and also a 21 millimeter ratcheting wrench. Now you're going to want to make sure that you have your wheels chalked on the RV. Because we have the rear jacks raised up, it's going to kind of put it in an angle, and I really want to make sure that this doesn't move while we're underneath it. Another thing I suggest is making sure you have a good light as well as safety glasses on, because you're going to be doing this a lot laying down, and you don't want this falling in your eyes. Now I've also gone ahead and I've sprayed these down with a penetrating oil and let them sit for a little bit, and that way it's going to help loosen that up before we actually put some tools on it. So since those have been soaking for a while, I'm going to go ahead, put my socket on here, and these may give you a fight, so just be patient, but let's just try to get some rotation to where it's knocked loose. Oh, we got it moving just a little bit. I'm going to get a little bit more rotation. There we go. Okay, and now I'm going to swap over to the other one and get that knocked loose. Okay, so So now that I know those are moving, I can go ahead and I'm gonna grab my ratcheting wrench here. Now on the back side, there's gonna be a little nut that has a plate onto it, and that's going to be there to actually kind of catch and tighten and loosen as necessary. So just be careful when loosening these up that you know that that plate is there. That way they're not falling on your head. So when you get closer to them being really loose, you can actually reach on the back side of the frame and hold on to that weld-on nut. So go ahead and take these off. So here's the bolts that came out of the frame rail, and here's that back welded on nut with the tab. Now it's important that you have this facing to where that tab is kind of out, sticking out flush with the end of the actual nut. And that's going to just catch and allow you to tighten, so it's a pretty nice design there. So we're going to be reusing this same hardware. We're simply going to put this bracket in place. This is going to sit on the outside of the frame rail. We'll run our bolts in, and then we'll tighten it up. So let's get that installed. So we're going to slide this in just where our hardware was previous, and now I'm going to just take my bolts and feed them in. And then I'm going to grab my weld nuts here. And it doesn't really matter where that tab goes. It's actually going to find its spot to when you tighten it. So just kind of get that threaded on there just to start it. I have those hand threaded on. I'm just going to go through and get these tightened down. You don't have to get too crazy with the hand tools because we're going to actually go back with the torque wrench and make sure they're at the proper setting. So now we're going to torque these down based on the manufacturer's recommendations in the instruction manual. Now if you need to just get one in a pinch, generally you can rent any torque wrench from an auto parts store, and that's going to kind of be a good option. That way you can get the job finished. Now I've actually added an extra extension here, and that puts it outside of the tire to make this rotation a little bit easier. Go ahead and make sure they're at the proper torque setting. So now we have ours up on a lift, and I know that most people don't have lifts at home. So you'll be doing this underneath, but I'm going to kind of show you this. Now, what we're going to be doing is loosening these up from the actual U-bolts. Now this plate will drop down, so it's important you don't just take all of these off. And these are going to be a little bit tricky, so you can see they are wet here because I soaked them with penetrating oil. You're going to want to do that, give it some time so it can actually start loosening that up. And then you're going to go with 1 1/8 and 1/8 socket, and we'll get these knocked loose. So we're using a pretty large air impact gun here, and we'll see if we can't get these off. Now a word of caution, since you're going to be doing this on the ground, you're going to want to make sure that you put a nice jack stand or a jack underneath the axle. Reason being is once this U-bolt actually becomes detached, the axle can drop down a little bit, and that's going to make it really hard to do. Something else I'm going to note is there's a plate that sits on the top of the leaf springs. Now it's in a little block where it holds it in place, but if you loosen this up too much and it moves around, it can pop out and possibly land on your head. So keep that in mind. It sits up here where the U-bolts are. Now your axle is really only going to drop if it's not on the ground. So if you're working with it flat on the ground, you shouldn't have any problems. But if you've raised your rear jacks to gain a little bit of access, that's something to consider or keep in mind, because when you do lower this down, that axle is going to kind of come with it. So just be prepared, or lower your jack down enough to where you have enough room to work, but the axle's still actually sitting, or the tires are sitting on the ground. So as I'm loosening this, you can actually see the rust kind of shooting out, and it's just kind of working through those threads that didn't have the penetrating oil actually on there. So it might help to go back and give it a little spray in between loosening them, and that's going to just help get these off a little bit easier. Now this is going to be a little bit tricky. They are on there pretty tight, so if you don't have a large impact like this, you might really want to get a large breaker bar to get that leverage to knock those loose. So I have 3 of them off. This last one, I'm going to leave just a few threads on there. This plate is pretty heavy, and so having that little bit of thread on there is going to hold this in place, and that way it doesn't fall down when you're actually taking these off. So go ahead and you can get that one knocked loose to where it's just hand tight on there. Now this last one has been pretty tricky. In fact, we ended up using a large ratchet with a pipe on it just to get a little bit more leverage as our gun was struggling. So again, just take your time, make sure you go through, put a little bit of penetrating oil, and that's gonna help move it along. So we'll go ahead and get this off. And then we have our hand tightened one on there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and grab my plate, and that way we can get ready to feed that on. So now this plate is actually going to sandwich on here, and we're going to reuse those same washers and nuts that we just took off. So be careful, because this plate is able to fall once this comes off. So you're going to want to support this, as they're both kind of heavy. And this portion here, you can see it juts in. This should be facing towards the rear and center of the vehicle. So make sure that you're kind of threaded in there. Sometimes those U-bolts, they're a little bit wider, and you might have to just kind of give it a quick push just for it to drop in. And you'll see kind of once you push up, it almost holds it in place, almost. But right here, I'm gonna just take this off, and then I'm gonna put my plate in place, and then I'm gonna wanna make sure that I have my hardware handy, and that way we can get at least one of them hand threaded on there. Like I said, the U-bolts can be a little bit tricky to feed through, but I tell you what, I got this one side fed through, so I'm gonna go ahead, just to save my shoulders from holding this up, we'll get this in place. Now I'm gonna get these all hand threaded on, and before we tighten it up, we have this little bracket plate. This is the one that sits above the actual leaf springs, and that U-bolt rests on here. Now there is a little circle that this sits into, so we're going to want to make sure that we get those fed back in before we tighten it down. And it's pretty easy. You'll be able to kind of raise that U-bolt, and you'll just slide it under, and those are going to rest in here. So we'll get the plate in. We'll just kind of raise our U-bolt up like that. Now, like I said, there is a notch here, and that's going to sit, so it should be sitting flush. Make sure that your U-bolts are actually in the channel, and then we can go ahead and tighten this down. Now when we tighten these up, you're going to want to make sure that you don't tighten one side up too much, so we're going to kind of alternate each corner as we go, and I'm not going to tighten it all the way up until I know that they're all kind of evenly gone up. So let's tighten these. So now we're going to go through and torque these to spec. In order to get to the torque settings, check your instruction manual, and we'll be using a large torque wrench like this to get that proper setting. So now we're going to grab our shackle here, and they're going to be uniform from one side to the other. So we'll go ahead and we're going to fit that through. We're going to take our bolt and our supplied nut that's in the hardware. We're just going to put this on the lower hole for now, and just hand tighten this nut on real quick. All right. Now at this point, we have this side pretty well set up, ready to accept the rear sway bar. So you're going to want to repeat the exact same process on the actual passenger side, and then we can get our sway bar put up. So now you're going to want to grab your bushings here and also the bushing mount. So you'll see these are actually split, so that's going to be nice. That way we can actually just kind of put them on the actual sway bar, and then these are going to sandwich those up. But we're also going to want to take some of the grease that was included in the kit, and that's just going to keep this moving nice and smooth, and it's also not going to cause any squeaking over time, as that rubber kind of has friction on it. So pretty easy. What we'll do, we'll take the split bushing off. We're just going to take a little finger of it here. We're just going to kind of coat the inside of it, and you want this whole area coated in that grease. Make sure you do that to both of them, and then you can actually place it on the sway bar. So now we're going to take our short bolts here, and these are going to go into our brackets here that we mounted up, and I'm going to put it on the furthest back hole, and then we're going to feed our bracket here with our bushing up. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually kind of try to raise one side. You may want to prop up the other side, but we're going to try to get this threaded through, and we'll get our flat washer and our nut on. And I'm just going to get this hand threaded on so it's going to hold that in place. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the back one on the other side as well, so we have the sway bar supported. Now, in order to get these brackets to line up, you may have to move them side to side, and that way you can find that center ground between the sway bar to make sure that they both line up. So make sure that you have all 4 bolts and nuts on your actual sway bar on our bushing bracket, and then you can go ahead and tighten those up. Now, these also have torque settings, so we're going to go back with our torque wrench and make sure they're torqued down properly. Now, as far as tightening these down, they are 2 different sizes. So we have a 5/8 for the bolt head, and then we have a 11/16 for the actual nut. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to tighten those up before getting my torque wrench on there. Now we're going to take our sway bar and we're going to raise it into the shackles here, and you may have to kind of work around with it. Sometimes feeding it past and then dragging it back is going to get this aligned. And you want your sway bar to sit as level as possible, so on our specific chassis here, it's actually going to sit at this lowest hole. So once we have that in place, we can go ahead, we're going to take our long bolts that are supplied with the hardware, and you're going to want to feed it from the outside of the vehicle towards the middle. Once that's passed through, we'll go ahead and put the nut on the back end. And you can go ahead and do that on the other side. So now we'll be tightening these down. There is no torque setting. Really what we're going for is where these are going to be flush. There's not going to be a gap in between here, but if they start to swell up a little bit, that means that you might have overdone it and it's a little too tight, because you want it in place, but if this is too tight and it can't move, it really doesn't allow the sway bar to function. So we'll go ahead and tighten this down. I'm going to be using a 24mm on our end here, and then with my socket I'm going to just go ahead and zip this into place. So as I tighten, I can see that this is starting to compress, so I'm going to just back this off just 1 or 2. And that should be good. So now we're going to go ahead and repeat that process on the other side, and then we're also going to be doing these top ones as well with that same procedure. Now with all these tightened down and torqued to the proper spec, we're ready to take it out, drive it around a little bit, and then after driving around, you're going to want that to kind of loosen up a little bit, and then go back and check all the tightness on all your hardware. And that was a look and installation of the Roadmaster Rear Sway Bar on a 2018 Thor Windsport.